Most countries and economies around the world are grappling with an economic downturn and bracing themselves for a looming recession. There is one country with an economy that has been booming for the past few years and is expected to make an almost 8% expansion this year, and that country is Vietnam. We have Professor Byung-joo of Hankuk University of Foreign Studies joining us to discuss the Korea-Vietnam relations, as Seoul's Foreign Minister Park Jin is making a 2-day visit to Hanoi to mark the 30th anniversary of diplomatic relations between the two nations. Good morning, Professor Kim.
Good morning.
So today, the Korean foreign minister is meeting with his counterpart in Vietnam. Vietnam is an up-and-coming economy and continuing to play a bigger role in the Southeast Asian region of the global economy, as well as their importance in the ASEAN group. So, give us what's on the agenda for the prime ministers.
Yeah, the foreign ministers meeting that's taking place today in Hanoi will cover a broad range of issues. But first, most outstanding issue is, of course, how to further strengthen the bilateral tie between Seoul and Hanoi at this important juncture of celebrating 30 years, 3 decades of setting up the diplomatic ties. And so when we talk about 30 years, we are, of course, talking about the 1992 action of setting up the diplomatic ties. And it has been 30 years. A lot of things happen. And I think they will look back on the achievements so far, and then they'll talk about the more things that needs to be achieved going forward. I heard the focus this time will be on the exchange of people and culture, recognizing that on the economic side, much has been achieved. Not that economic side is less important, but just the kind of like having an even level of water level going up. The economic side has gone up really quickly. Mm-hmm. Then they want to now achieve the more of the cultural and people exchange along with that as well. Going beyond the bilateral ties, of course, next month, I believe, in Cambodia, there will be a summit meeting between Korean president and ASEAN heads of the states. So ASEAN new context, ASEAN policies and so on will be also talked about with Vietnam as an important ASEAN member. Mm-hmm. And on this side, Korean side, the response to North Korea's missile launches and provocations and asking for demanding Vietnam's cooperation to support Korea as well. Foreign Minister of Korea will be meeting the head of the states, Hankuk, today or tomorrow. I'm not sure exactly the timing of it, but he will be meeting head of the state of Vietnam. And the Korean foreign minister also will speak at the Diplomatic Academy in Hanoi, and then he'll be having meetings with Koreans in Vietnam, the business leaders, as well as Korean community leaders, and so on. So looks like he'll have a very busy schedule going ahead.
Right. And just for our listeners who might not be so familiar, where does the Korea-Vietnam relation stand today?
There are quite an impressive numbers we are talking about here. Of course, when we talk about Vietnam, we often think about, as I said, earlier, economic and business ties. And I would assume that not that many people, Korean side, aware of the fact that as of, like, for example, 2020, and then I'm sure it's the same as last year as well, for instance, Vietnam is number 3 export destination and the number 4 trading partner, export destination. Korea is selling our products to China as number 1 market. Mm-hmm. United States number 2. Those are no surprises. Everyone knows that.
Right.
But Vietnam comes as number 3, actually. Yeah, above Japan, India, Singapore, Germany, or other countries. Vietnam is number 3 after China and the United States. So this is a very, very important partner for Korean economy and business. And in terms of investment, also, Vietnam, is almost on the top of the list. These days, of course, the for the past several decades, Korea has invested a lot in China, for instance, and also Korea has been accelerating its investment in the United States, have pledged a lot of new investment into the United States in the process of global supply chain reshuffling and so on. But Vietnam comes immediately after that. So investment, trade, and everything, Vietnam is one of the most important partners for Korea. And you may already know this and may not. That is, which is the country that produces the largest of Samsung mobile phones? And a lot of people say, well, Samsung is a Korean company, so it has to be Korea. The answer is no. It's Vietnam that produces the largest number of Samsung mobile phones. So those numbers are just as they are very, very, impressive indeed. And Vietnam has long pronounced that Korea is their model of development. They want to learn from Korea in terms of how to develop their economy. And so as a result of it, Vietnam is Korea's number one recipient of development cooperation, and a very important country in that regard. And of course, on the non-economic side of it, we know Vietnam is a very important market for Korean cultural products, K-Wave for sure. We have had for a long time Korean Park Hang-seo leading Vietnamese national soccer team, for instance, almost their national hero has become. And on a very personal and the individual side of it, I think the number shows from 2010 and for several years, Vietnamese coming to Korea to marry Korean spouse has numbered about above 40,000 a year for a long time. I don't know the most recent numbers, but that was the number that we saw that began, the trend that began about 10 years ago. So almost 40,000 a year. So that means they are here in Korea. They have become important members of Korean society, and their children, offspring will grow to become very important and critical members of this society as well. So those are very, very impressive and very critical numbers that we have to keep in mind.
Right. And one of the, I guess, not so official, but a good, I guess, barometer of how I judge a country's influence is by the number of that country's ethnic food restaurants that are available. So when we, look at the type of Vietnamese food that was available here in Korea 10, 15 years ago, all you could find was just, your simplified pho. But now you could find real ethnic Vietnamese cuisine more and more often in neighborhoods in Ansan, Pyeongtaek, where a lot of the Vietnamese populations are. And even some small pockets in Seoul, you could really find great Vietnamese food other than just pho. So I think, like you talked about, the cultural exchange is definitely taking place following the economy and the economic growth that the two countries are continuing to show partnerships in.
Very important element, yes.
But when we're talking about Korea's future with Vietnam, of course, we have to keep in mind China. So how should we put this three-way relationship into perspective?
Yeah, for sure, in the midst of this large-scale, unprecedented reshuffling of global value chain all around the world, Vietnam, after having become such an important partner, its status, its importance is ever more increasing altogether. And so, for instance, in recent months, we've been hearing the semiconductor industry, Samsung Electronics announcing further plans of setting up their production facilities in Vietnam. That's going together with other global players like Intel of the United States and the companies in Japan, companies from Japan and Taiwan also making their announcements of further investment in Vietnam. So Vietnam as a whole, as an economy, is fast becoming an alternative to many important economic players around the world as the alternative to China. Many countries and businesses are working and preparing for future without China. They mostly believe, China can never go away. China will remain important market, but until they see certain political changes that will ensure them the sustainability, long-term sustainability of China in political sense, the business and countries will continue to actively look for alternative. And Vietnam definitely, without a question, tops the list. Mm-hmm. And so that's why we see all these, hear all these announcements of further investment. For Koreans, for a long time, they are talking about the work ethics of Vietnamese people, their high education, work ethics that comes from kind of Confucian tradition that makes their workforce, their work culture, very similar to Korea, they say, relatively speaking. And they're getting better educated, and then overall, the experience that the workforce has been accumulating for the past several decades, and the youth population that's very committed to further education and globalizing their economy and so on. They say this is a really, really important destination. Of course, having said all those positive side, of course, there are lingering concerns in the minds of Korean business. I hear that about still the need to increase their transparency, and then business ethics, for instance, like making transactions based on rule of law and keeping trust and keeping long-term relationships and so on. Those sides, they say they need further improvement and strengthening. But as a whole, of course, in putting China into the picture, Vietnam's importance is further being enhanced because of what's happening in regard to China here.
Okay. And let's increase our focus and broaden it a little bit here and go to the ASEAN level. I'm sure the same China-related considerations apply at the ASEAN level as well. So where does Korea's relation stand in that group of countries?
Yeah, ASEAN, Vietnam, we've been talking about it, but Vietnam is an important member of ASEAN. And what we have in mind is when we talk about this importance of Vietnam, they usually largely similarly apply to other countries of ASEAN members as well. When we talk about ASEAN, it's a body of 10 member countries and began during the 60s with Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, and Philippines. Mm-hmm. And then during the 80s, Brunei joined, and during the 90s, Vietnam, Laos, Myanmar, and Cambodia joined. So these are 10 member country body here, and the importance that we talked about regarding Vietnam largely apply there as well. For instance, like countries like Singapore. Singapore is on its own, as we know, right, because of their level of advancement of the society, their economy, finance, and all these things, openness, globalization. They're one class of its own, but there are other countries that are catching up with Vietnam, for instance, as a next destination of production basis for world economies and so on. So definitely ASEAN as a whole is a critical destination for our trade coming up, increasing even further fast, and then business partner as well for Korea. And also going forward with China in mind, with issues like South China Sea and so on, ASEAN members, ASEAN as a one entity is fast becoming important partner for national security cooperation and global security cooperation as well, together with United States and then Japan, for instance, being added in the picture as well.
Mm-hmm. And jumping a little bit ahead due to time constraints, how should we put our discussion in an even broader perspective that includes the entire Asia-Pacific regions? And what are some of the important points to keep in mind from a Korean perspective?
Right. When we are talking about Vietnam and ASEAN countries, of course, as I mentioned, we are talking about also the big picture where China comes in and changes dynamics here as well. And we are adding Japan, also important partner for cooperation for the region. For Northeast Asian region, not only that, but also East Asia broadly defined. We have had this mechanism called ASEAN Plus 3. This was set up at the end of 1990s, and the head of states of China, Japan, and Korea are meeting with ASEAN heads of states regularly, and that it's what's coming up. Korea summit meeting with ASEAN states they're coming up in Cambodia next month as well. So, ASEAN is standing alone entity as a very important member of the global society, but Korea, Japan, and China have been actively engaging, and Korea should never fall behind in terms of its efforts, and actually should lead and get ahead of Japan and China in terms of strengthening its cooperation with ASEAN members, and that's what we are expecting. And previous government, Moon, has been talking about new Southern policy, meaning that because of the changes involving China, Korea is looking very actively towards South, meaning ASEAN. And now, next month in Cambodia, this new Yoon government, relatively new Yoon government, will probably add further efforts in accelerating such efforts of Korea's, its strengthening efforts to strengthen its ties with the ASEAN members next month. That's what we're expecting.
Okay. Well, Professor Kim, thank you so much for your time this morning and your insights into the Korea-Vietnam relations.
Thank you very much.
If you're listening to our program using the podcast service, just a reminder that we do go live Monday through Friday, 7 a.m. Korea Standard Time. So tune in and help us make the show more informative by giving us your input. See you bright and early on Good Morning Seoul.